A steadfast symbol of communist rule, Fidel Castro led Cuba through decades of sanctions and global tensions. To some, he was a revolutionary hero who uplifted the working class and championed equality. To others, he was a harsh autocrat who suppressed dissent and curtailed freedoms. His leadership remains a subject of fierce debate, yet his influence on Cuba and global politics is undeniable. This is the story of Fidel Castro's complex and enduring legacy. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, near Biran, in Cuba's Oriente province. He was the third of 6 children, growing up with his brothers Raul and Ramon, and sisters Angela, Emma, and Agustina. His father, Angel Castro, a Spanish immigrant, owned a prosperous sugar plantation that mainly supplied the American-owned United Fruit Company, a dominant force in the region's agriculture. Fidel's mother, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, originally worked as a maid to Angel's first wife. When Fidel was 15, Angel ended his first marriage and married Lina. At 17, Fidel was formally acknowledged by his father, and his surname changed from Ruz to Castro. Raised in affluence amidst widespread Cuban poverty, Castro attended elite Jesuit schools where he absorbed Spanish pride alongside his education. While academically talented, he often caused mischief and was drawn to sports, excelling in baseball, basketball, and track. He studied at Colegio Dolores in Santiago and El Colegio de Belén in Havana. In 1945, he graduated and enrolled in law school at the University of Havana. There, Castro became deeply involved in Cuban nationalism and anti-imperialism, redirecting his focus toward politics and socialism. By 1947, Fidel Castro had grown fervent about social justice and joined an expedition aimed at toppling Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. Although the effort collapsed before taking off, Castro's determination for reform remained steadfast. The following year, he traveled to Bogota, Colombia, to engage in anti-government riots, further cementing his revolutionary resolve. In Cuba, Castro joined the Partido Ortodoxo, an anti-communist reformist party founded by Eduardo Chibas, a presidential candidate dedicated to exposing government corruption and warning about General Fulgencio Batista's ambitions to reclaim power. Chibas deeply influenced Castro's political outlook. However, in August of 1951, Chibas tragically ended his life during a radio broadcast after his allies failed to deliver proof of government corruption. During this period, Castro married Mirta Diaz Balart, a woman from an affluent political family, and the couple had a son, Fidel, in 1949. The marriage introduced Castro to higher social circles and political connections, but his growing interest in Marxist ideas began to shape his ideological path. Castro intended to run for a congressional seat in the 1952 elections, but Batista's coup that March dissolved the government, canceled elections, and left Castro without a political platform or steady income. Batista established a dictatorship backed by the military, economic elite, and U.S. recognition. In response, Castro helped form the Movement, an underground group advocating armed resistance. On July 26, 1953, he led 150 supporters in an attack on the Moncada military barracks near Santiago de Cuba. The insurrection failed, leading to Castro's capture, trial, and a 15-year prison sentence alongside his brother Raul. While imprisoned, Fidel Castro renamed his group the 26th of July Movement and maintained leadership through correspondence. In 1955, he and his comrades were released under a Batista-led amnesty deal, prompting Castro and his brother Raul to flee to Mexico to continue planning their revolution. In Mexico, Castro met fellow Cuban exiles and Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, who shared his vision for change through violent rebellion. Guevara joined the movement. On December 2, 1956, Castro and 80 insurgents arrived in Cuba aboard the boat Granma. However, most were quickly killed or captured by Batista's forces. Castro, Raul, Guevara, and a small group escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they launched a guerrilla war. Over 2 years, they organized resistance groups, and their forces grew larger, establishing a parallel government in liberated areas, implementing agrarian reforms. By 1958, Castro's campaigns successfully captured key territories, and growing discontent among Batista's forces led to the regime's collapse. Batista fled in January of 1959, leaving Castro in control. A provisional government formed, with Castro as commander-in-chief and later Prime Minister. Trials and executions of Batista loyalists followed. Fidel Castro enacted sweeping reforms to diminish U.S. economic dominance, nationalizing industries, and compensating foreign companies based on undervalued property assessments. This strained U.S.-Cuba relations as American companies faced significant losses. Despite denying communist leanings, Castro's policy mirrored Soviet-style governance. In 1959, Castro visited the U.S., meeting with the National Press Club, but was snubbed by President Dwight Eisenhower. That same year, his Agrarian Reform Act limited land holdings and banned foreign ownership. While aiming to empower independent farmers, the policy placed land under state control. By the year's end, Castro had radicalized his revolution, ousted dissenters, and censored critical media. Ties with the Soviet Union deepened as Cuba signed a 1960 trade deal for oil, leading to the nationalization of U.S. refineries when they refused to process it. In retaliation, the U.S. cut Cuba's sugar imports, igniting decades of hostility. Tensions escalated in 1961 when the U.S. broke diplomatic ties and Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The failed CIA-backed mission bolstered Castro's power and led him to declare Cuba a Marxist-Leninist state, further aligning with the USSR. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Secret negotiations between the U.S. and USSR resolved the conflict, sidelining Castro and leaving him humiliated. Despite setbacks, Castro unified his revolutionary groups into Cuba's Communist Party in 1965 and began exporting armed revolution to Latin America and Africa. He positioned himself as a voice for Third World nations, though costly interventions strained Cuba's economy. The U.S. attempted numerous CIA-led assassination plots, 638 by Cuban estimates, but all failed. Castro famously mocked these efforts, claiming he'd win Olympic gold in evasion. Domestically, Castro expanded education and healthcare, achieving high literacy rates and low infant mortality. However, he suppressed dissent through executions, imprisonment, and forced emigration. Tens of thousands were killed, and hundreds of thousands fled, including 120,000 during the 1980 Mariel boat lift, which Castro used to send prisoners and mentally ill individuals to the U.S. Though Castro improved social systems, his rule curtailed freedoms and left a polarized legacy of both progress and oppression. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union plunged Cuba into economic turmoil as the country lost its primary source of cheap oil and a guaranteed market for its sugar imports. The Cuban economy contracted sharply, with 85% of its markets disappearing, leading to soaring unemployment and inflation. Despite these hardships, Castro maintained his grip on power, urging the United States to lift its economic embargo, though his appeals were rejected. In response, Castro implemented limited market reforms, legalizing the U.S. dollar, encouraging international investment, and promoting tourism. In 1996, he even invited Cuban exiles in the U.S. to return and start businesses. After Hurricane Michelle devastated Cuba in 2001, Castro declined U.S. humanitarian aid but negotiated a one-time purchase of food. To combat an energy crisis, he traded Cuban medical services for Venezuelan oil and shuttered dozens of factories to conserve resources. Speculation about Castro's health grew in the late 1990s, intensifying after his 2006 surgery for gastrointestinal bleeding. On July 31, 2006, he temporarily transferred power to his brother, Raul, who had long been his second-in-command. By February of 2008, Castro officially stepped down as president, citing his declining health, and Raul formally assumed the role. Castro also relinquished his leadership of the Communist Party in 2011, though he claimed to have resigned years earlier. In retirement, Castro remained a vocal figure, penning a column, Reflections of Fidel, and publishing his autobiography, My Life. While largely removed from politics, he met with foreign leaders and hosted high-profile visitors like Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. However, when U.S. President Barack Obama visited Cuba in 2016, Castro declined to meet him, later criticizing the visit as insincere. Fidel Castro passed away on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90. His brother Raul announced the news on Cuban state television. Castro's legacy is deeply polarizing. He is hailed by supporters as a revolutionary hero who championed education and healthcare while resisting imperialism. Critics condemn his authoritarian rule, suppression of dissent, and human rights violations. Regardless of perspective, his influence on Cuba and global politics remains profound.